Is ADHD affected by the trillions of microbiota in your body? And is there a way that we can actually harness that power for treatment? So today, I, a drug scientist, will explain the gut-brain connection seen in ADHD. So if you haven't been reading the genuinely fascinating studies out there on the microbiome, you should, because we have some really cool science suggesting that basically the bacteria, the microbiota that's in our gut, that is influencing all sorts of different things. So people are actually developing kind of like personalized diets based on what your microbiome looks like. We can also do things like have fecal transplants to help patients with depression. So this is a kind of promising new treatment. Now, fecal transplants sound like exactly what they are. You can either take a poop pill, so you can have a fecal transplant that way, or you can also do an enema or even a colonoscopy to get a fecal transplant. And we see that this actually has kind of promising results for treating people with especially severe treatment-resistant depression. And its effects on things like depression are probably because the microbiome plays a large role in brain development. This is very early on. So this critical period in which the microbiome can play kind of a role, and it might be irreversible after that. So yeah, our personal microbiota in our body might play a role in how our brain actually works. And this is probably especially true for things like neurodevelopmental disorders. So things like ADHD, which kind of occur relatively early on, and then they might have different trajectories. Now, side note, whenever I talk about this, people are like, yeah, there is no difference in course of disorders. Like people are always like, oh yeah, like ADHD is a genetic disorder, and once you have it, that's it, you have it. But that is not true of basically any disorder. So we're fine with talking about this with things like depression. So you've probably heard somebody say like they have a depressive episode because somebody close to them recently passed away, and so they are in a depressive state, but then eventually they get out of it. That is true for other disorders too, including things like ADHD. So what we see is that children with ADHD, about 40 to 60% of them still have ADHD symptoms persistent to adulthood. That means that 40 to 60% of them do not have symptoms go into adulthood as well. And this is true for even things like schizophrenia. So what we see is that about 20 to 25% of people who have one single episode of schizophrenia, so one psychotic episode, they might not ever have one ever again. Just wanted to mention that as a tangent because I always get that comment in all of the videos that I make. So I'm just gonna inform you about it right now. So we know that the microbiome plays a role in things like brain development, and we know that neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD typically start early on. So what do we know about this combination of the microbiome and ADHD? Like, can we actually treat ADHD with things like probiotics? Here is what we know in terms of the science. So the first study on this was done less than 10 years ago. So it was done in 2017 on Dutch teens where they took fecal samples and then kind of did a DNA analysis of a variety of them. And what they were looking at here was like, is there different diversity in the bacterium in your microbiome? Are there certain levels of certain things that are higher than others? And what they found was that there weren't any diversity differences, but they did see that there is this higher level of a specific type of bacterium known as bifidobacterium. And that's intriguingly linked to an enzyme, which is linked to a specific precursor of dopamine. If you know anything about ADHD, you know that is linked to dopamine. So there might be something here. Now, the problem was that study was genuinely terrible. They didn't control for things like medication. Also, it was just a very small study, but it was the first one done of its type. So the next study is kind of built on this. They try to be like a better version of study one. And let me tell you, the results are not actually that great. So we see all sorts of kind of random little differences between things. One study found reduced diversity in patients with ADHD, and they also found that in the mothers of people with ADHD, but not in the fathers, but we don't necessarily know what that means. Another found differences in ruminococcus, which was linked to inattention, but this was not changed by ADHD meds. And then there's this additional weird set of findings that's linked to both ADHD and some of the other disorders that it's linked to. So for example, we see a lot of comorbidities, so people who have both ADHD and autism. So this is typically known as ADHD. We also see that people with ADHD are more likely to have things like asthma and eczema. And both of these things are linked to specific microbiome aspects as well. So we see that lower levels of Faecalibacterium, I have no idea if that's how you actually pronounce that, by the way. I've tried to find it online and I can't, and I've been reading a lot of Throne of Glass. I'm just going to go with the Fae portion of it. We see that there's lower levels of Faecalibacterium in people with ADHD as well as people with things like asthma and eczema. There are also high levels of desulfovibrio in patients with ADHD and patients with autism spectrum disorder as well. So that might explain some of that comorbidity there. Now, side note, I also do not know how to pronounce desulfovibrio. It sounds vaguely like a Harry Potter curse. If I wanted to talk about anything based on the books by She Who Shall Not Be Named. And in one of the weirder studies, they analyzed the floor dust of 3-month-olds and looked to see if they were more likely to get ADHD later. And they found that there were some differences there, like more fungus and less diversity is linked to ADHD. But they're also like, this is just a study of floor dust correlating with ADHD. So like, viewer be warned. Now, does changing your microbiome actually reduce ADHD symptoms? So we see that changing things like the bifidobacterium that I was talking about earlier, that can actually potentially reduce ADHD symptoms. And another study gave a form of lactobacillus to pregnant mothers for 4 weeks before they had their offspring children. The word I'm looking for is children. They found that lactobacillus treatment actually seemed to reduce the likelihood that their children were going to have ADHD or autism spectrum disorder later in life. But like giving straight probiotics and even symbiotics, those don't seem to really do much to ADHD symptoms. There's not good evidence of that at all. So like, how might this all work? So we do see that the microbiome is linked to like basically everything. Like our gut bacteria might actually be doing things like increasing neuroinflammation and increasing oxidative stress, which might contribute to the symptoms of ADHD. We see that it's also linked to things like neurogenesis, so the creation of new neurons, as well as like genetic changes, which might influence how likely we are to basically make new neurotransmitters or like take them back from the receptor. We also see that it's linked to things like sleep, especially in children with autism spectrum disorder, which, as I mentioned, very closely linked to things like ADHD. Scientists suspect that some of those sleep disruptions that you see in patients with autism spectrum disorder, they might be occurring in ADHD patients as well. And so maybe the gut microbiome might be behind that too. The problem is we don't have good evidence of this yet. Now, as I mentioned, the first study was done in 2017. And in case you couldn't tell based on this video, the microbiome was incredibly complicated. And so now we have like paths to go on. We're like, okay, well, maybe if we start affecting this system, or maybe if we start looking at this when it relates to sleep, we might have something there. But we're at those very early stages right now. So does the science suggest that like you need to be taking probiotics or prebiotics or symbiotics, or you just have a yogurt every single day? No, not at this point it does not. But we're not ruling out for the future either.